Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final session of this bicentennial Cutting Edge series. I am standing in now as Ingrid has moved on to new adventures. I am the Program Director and Catalyst in Chief of the McGill Sustainability Systems Initiative. We'll start by acknowledging that McGill University and many of us attending today's meeting are located on the island of Tiohtià:ke or Montreal. This unceded land has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe Nation. McGill recognizes, honors, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. Today's presentation is going to be hosted by three student ambassadors, Annie Lee and Samantha Gall, who are both third-year undergraduate students majoring in biology, and Caitlin Law, who is a first-year undergrad in biology and anthropology. So I will now hand over to the student ambassadors.
Today's speaker is Professor Sakata from the Department of Biology here at McGill. He studied neuroscience at the University of Texas at Austin and completed his PhD there. Through his research in neurobiology, he studies the mechanisms behind social communication through songbirds.
Studies in songbirds have shown that their vocal learning and performance process share common features with the speech acquisition and control in humans, making them an excellent model animal to reveal the fundamental biology on the processing and the modeling of vocal communication. So in today's lecture, Professor Sakata will talk about how birds produce their songs in a similar manner to how humans learn to speak, despite that humans and birds are distantly related.
Is that me? Am I up? Okay. I'm going to share my screen. I assume everyone can hear me and see my screen. I'm going to move this thing, all the different controls. Okay, sorry, everyone. Good evening, everyone. So I wanted to start by thanking Caitlin and Annie for the lovely introduction. And of course, thank you to Ingrid and Heather and to all the other organizers for the Cutting Edge lecture series. Thank you for inviting me to talk about my work. So I must say it's an honor to be part of the lecture series commemorating the McGill Bicentennial, and I hope to provide some historical context to my work, including some allusions to some of McGill's history in the field that I study. Now, I'm going to preface my talk today saying that I'm a little under the weather. I'm having this COVID thing work through my system, and I apologize if I start to lose my voice in the middle of the talk, but I'll try not to. All right, so it is springtime, and a telltale sign of spring is hearing of the sounds of these various birds around our neighborhood. Well, today I want to tell you that studying these sounds and the birds that produce these sounds can give us some important insight into how we as humans communicate with each other. Now, there are two main points I want to highlight and expand on in this talk. The first is that songbirds learn their songs, and they do so in a manner that resembles how humans learn how to speak. And this I want to just point out, there are many animals that use sounds to communicate with each other, but the vast majority of those animals, for those vast majority of animals, the sounds that they produce are actually innate. They're born with the ability to produce those sounds. But in a small slither of those species, and those species include species like songbirds and humans, these species they're not born with the ability to produce their species typical sounds. They have to learn them through some various experiences during development. And we know that there's a lot of parallels in how songbirds learn their songs and how humans learn how to speak. So that's an important point. The second point is, just like humans, songbirds use their vocalizations during social interactions, and they actually adjust their vocalizations in response to their audience. And it's these 2 points that I want to sort of expand on in the talk. And it's these 2 points. And so, we study these aspects of birdsong in the lab, and we study this for biology's sake, because we just don't understand these species. But we also study these species, these questions, because we think they can gain some insight into mechanisms of communication in humans. All right, so for today's talk, this is sort of a brief outline. I'm going to first introduce sort of the field of birdsong research and include a little bit of a brief history, this being the McGill bicentennial. I'm going to give some reflection of the history of the field. It's hard to get that 200-year mark, but I have some broader, longer historical context for this. So after the introduction, I'm going to discuss some of the work from my lab looking at modulators and mechanisms of vocal learning. And then I'm going to, in the last part, I'm going to talk about other experiments looking at modulators and mechanisms of vocal performance. All right, so first the introduction. So I guess I should first sort of contextualize songbirds as a species. Now there are about somewhere between 10 to 12,000 species of birds out there. And somewhere around 4,000 of these species are songbirds. And some of these species include robins, cardinals, sparrows, finches, corvids, like so crows, for example, canaries. So there's a lot of different songbird species. And the ones that we hear and we remember are generally these songbird species out in the neighborhoods. Now, the species that I study, as well as a number of other songbird researchers study, is the zebra finch. And we know a lot about the zebra finch song and its song development. And I think I want to walk you through one example of zebra finch vocal development, because I think it helps people sort of conceptualize the process of vocal learning in the species and think about how it can relate to humans. Okay, so here is a picture of the zebra finch here. So the zebra finches are sexually dimorphic. In this small image here, you have males on the left and the right, and between these two males are females, and the males have a more ornate plumage. And actually, it's in this species, only males learn and produce their songs. Both males and females vocalize, so females will vocalize, but the female vocal repertoire is an innate repertoire, so they don't need to learn their vocalizations. But it's the males that learn these songs. And just to mention, there are a number of other songbird species in which both males and females learn their vocalizations, but this, in the zebra finch, which is the most commonly studied songbird species, it's actually only the males that learn their songs. All right, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to first walk you through the tutor, or in this case, it's the father's song. And this is a spectrographic representation of song. You have frequency on the y-axis, time on the x-axis. This bar here is about 100 milliseconds. So this whole song here, or this motif, is about 600 milliseconds. And it sounds like this. Okay, one more time. Okay, that is the song of the father. And what we're going to do is we're going to take snapshots of this father's son's song as that son develops its song. So these birds start singing somewhere about 30 days of age. And when they start, they're basically babbling. They don't have a lot of control over the vocal musculature. Their sounds, these acoustic units, are quite noisy and they're very variable. And it sounds something like this. So kind of squeaky. And that's just this spectrogram is a snippet of the sound that I played back. So that's how these birds start vocalizing in this sort of what we think is bird babbling. Now, after a couple of weeks of practice, there's a little bit more, you can see a little bit more structure to these individual vocalizations, but this vocalization still doesn't look like its father's song, but I'll just play this for you. So there's more structure, but it's still, again, different from the father. But after another like a month or so of practice, then this juvenile produces a song that acoustically resembles its father or tutor song. So here's the pupil, 90 days of age. Here's a tutor. Here's a pupil. And then here's the tutor again. So hopefully you can hear the resemblance between those two vocalizations, and hopefully you can see this as well in the spectrogram. And the spectrogram is nice because it's sort of a static representation of sound. And in this case, these sounds are so rapid that it's sometimes hard to hear the similarities, but you can see them here, hopefully, that the individual acoustic elements, we call these acoustic elements syllables. So I might go back and forth between syllables and acoustic units, but we call these acoustic units in the pupil song look very similar to the acoustic units in the tutor song. And not only are the individual acoustic units similar between the pupil and the tutor, but also the sequencing, as well as the timing of these acoustic units, are similar between the pupil and the tutor. And these elements, the acoustic structure of the syllables, as well as the sequencing and the timing of these syllables, these are all learned by the juvenile from the father. And this process of development, you basically start at a bird that's babbling, and this bird practices and practices and practices, and over time, they are able to produce an accurate imitation of the tutor song. And hopefully, you can sort of you can see the patterns, how this pattern might resemble how human speech develops. Right? Initially, babies are babbling. They can form these sort of basic phonemes and syllables, and with time, they start becoming better at concatenating these syllables together to form these words that form the languages that are tutored to them or instructed to them during development. Now, I want to mention here, so this is just a sort of visual depiction of the trajectory of vocal development of one of the offspring of one of these fathers. And as scientists, if you think about this as well, just because the son's song looks and sounds like the father's song doesn't necessarily mean that it's learned, right? This could be similar because of genetic relatedness. So you need to have some experiments to really assess learning. And indeed, there's been a long history of experiments in songbirds like zebra finches. So basically, if you take an offspring from this father, but instead of housing it with his father, housing it with a male that sings a different song, what you find is that offspring from this father, if it's raised by a male that sings a different song, will end up producing that different song, not the song of its genetic father. So these are these kind of cross-fostering experiments. And these cross-fostering experiments are really the bread and butter of these pioneering experiments, sort of documenting song learning in songbirds. And just a little bit of a historical reference, when we think about the experiments or the pioneers of the study of song learning, we often ascribe it to two individuals. William Thorpe, who was a professor of animal behavior or ethology at the University of Cambridge, and he was one of the strongest advocates of behavioral biology in Great Britain. This is about the 50s and 60s. And the other is Peter Marler, who was an American ornithologist who actually studied under Thorpe and made a number of really important breakthroughs about animal communication, including many, many studies about the process of vocal learning in a variety of species of sparrows. And together, so Thorpe's seminal studies on chaffinches and Marler's really groundbreaking work on sparrows sort of highlighted the role of auditory and social experiences in the process of learning, and they really paved the way for decades of research on song learning and performance. And I thought it's nice to just walk you through one of these examples, these classic examples, and this is from Peter Marler's work. And so Peter did a lot of work with these white-crowned sparrows. Here's a song here. It's a really beautiful song. You might hear this. These guys are migrants through here periodically. But what Marler and Tamura did in the mid-60s was look at regional variation in song structure. So they looked at this population of white-crowned sparrows in the East Bay, in particular, three populations, one in Marin, one in Berkeley, and one in Sunset Beach. And what they did was they recorded a bunch of birds at each of these locations. And so here's three birds from Marin up in yellow. Here's in orange are three birds from Berkeley, and blue are three birds from Sunset Beach. And what you can hopefully see is that the songs of the different males within each of the populations are quite similar to each other. In addition, they're quite consistent differences between populations. Okay, so for example, in the Marin population, all these males have this whistle, this long whistle followed by this trill. And in the Berkeley population, you have a whistle that kind of gets broken up sometimes, followed by what's called a buzz element, and then you have this trill. So you do have these sort of regional differences in structure, and Marler kind of likened this to these dialects they have in human language. And so he called these song dialects. And not only, in addition to sort of describing these dialects, he demonstrated that these dialects aren't due to genetic differences between populations, but actually are a manifestation of learning. So you can you can do a cross-fostering study where you take a juvenile from Berkeley and you tutor it with an adult from Marin, and you see that juvenile from Berkeley actually learns the Marin song. So he had these critical experiments that indicate that these dialects are learned. So that was in the 60s, but it turns out that you can go way back. You can go 200 years before these experiments by Marler and Tamura and Thorpe. And so it's in about the 1770s. Where's my cursor now? Oops. Okay, there's my cursor. So in the 1770s, the Honorable Daines Barrington conducted a number of cross-fostering experiments just as a hobby. He was a lawyer and a naturalist in the 1700s. And he just did these experiments or these sort of studies to look at how birds might learn their songs if they're raised by a different species. So in 1773, he published an essay in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London titled Experiments and Observations on the Singing of Birds. And in it, he concludes that notes in birds are no more innate than language is in man and depend entirely upon the matter under which they are bred. And he came to this conclusion by raising birds of one species with birds of a different species. And so he writes, to prove this decisively, I took a common sparrow from the nest when it was fledged and educated him under a linnet. The bird, however, by accident heard a goldfinch also, and his song was therefore a mixture of the linnet and goldfinch songs. So he had sort of done these cross-fostering studies to really highlight the importance of auditory and social experiences during development for a bird song. Okay, so that's sort of my nod to the 200 number, but it's more like 250 years ago. In any case, since then, there have been many studies looking at song learning in songbirds, and people have discovered many parallels between vocal communication in humans and vocal communication in songbirds. So for example, vocalizations in both species are acquired by memorizing the sounds of others and then learning how to produce those songs. So it's basically, there's a period of auditory learning where individuals memorize what sounds they need to produce, and then they have to learn how to produce those songs. And they master that performance of those sounds via vocal practice. Now, many of the processes that are integral to speech acquisition are also important for bird song learning. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Many acoustic patterns are shared between bird song and speech. I'm also going to talk about this. And there are discrete and specialized brain areas for song learning and production in songbirds that resemble brain areas for speech acquisition and production in humans. So at the end, we think that these songbirds are really useful models to make some hypotheses or test mechanistic hypotheses about brain circuits important for speech acquisition in humans. Okay, moving on to some experiments. Sorry, let me get a drink of water first. Okay. Now, speech and language acquisition in humans is inherently a social process, right? Children listen to their parents, interact with their parents, and they learn how to speak and communicate with each other by sort of socially interacting with their parents or other adults or other peers. And it turns out that these social interactions are really important for speech and language acquisition, and actually enhance or promote the speech and language acquisition. So for example, if you, in a sort of a thought experiment, if you replace this mother with a speaker that produced the sounds of the mother, then this child wouldn't learn speech particularly well. And I guess one way to conceptualize this is you think about learning a second language and the relative difficulty of learning a second language, say from just a podcast or some other audio medium, versus learning a second language by interacting with another, like a native speaker of that second language. So social interactions are that they actually promote speech and language acquisition in humans. And we sought to sort of characterize the social influence in birds and to ask what degree social interactions might potentiate song learning in songbirds. And so here's one experiment that we did. And what we did was we had two sort of sets of birds, and these were kind of paired cohorts of birds. And so this is the tutor, and the tutor sings a song. Now, one bird in this cohort is housed with this tutor and is allowed to socially interact with this tutor. So this is our socially tutored bird. But we have another bird in the cohort who isn't able to interact with this tutor, but can hear every single song that this tutor produces. So basically there's a microphone above the tutor, And there's another juvenile that can hear all the tutor song, but just can't interact with that tutor. And these are our passively tutored birds. So we have socially tutored birds and passively tutored birds. Now, if you look at the song of the socially tutored birds, now these are the songs that they produce as adults. And so we're comparing the adult song to adult song of the pupil to the adult song of the tutor. And if you look at the socially tutored pupil, hopefully you can see that a number of the elements in the tutor song are also present in the pupil song. So I'd say about 4, the first, second, third, and fifth syllable of the tutor sequence or motif is present in the socially tutored pupil's motif. And if you use some quantitative measure of similarity, this bird song is about 70% similar to the tutor song. Now, if you look at the passively tutored bird from that cohort, this bird did not learn the tutor song particularly well. There are some elements of the passively tutored bird song that kind of resemble some aspects of the tutor song, but this song is not nearly as similar to the tutor song as the song of the socially tutored bird. And in fact, if you look at the quantitative measure, the song of the passively tutored bird is about half as similar to the tutor song than that of the socially tutored bird. Right, so this is one example. And if you look across all the groups in which we kind of tutored them either socially or passively in these cohorts, you do find a significant difference in the degree of learning. The socially tutored birds produce songs that are about twice as similar to the tutor than passively tutored birds. So this highlights that, like in humans, social interactions potentiate song learning in songbirds like the zebra finch. Now, we wondered how this might happen, or what is it about social interactions that promote learning? And we thought maybe birds that are socially tutored are more attentive to the tutor song. Maybe this the process of socially interacting with the tutor allows the pupil to be more attentive when the tutor sings its song. And so what we did was we quantified various measures of attention when the juvenile was actually was listening to the tutor song. And then we correlated those measures of attention with how well that pupil reproduced that tutor song as an adult. And the data are plotted here. So on the x-axis is the attention to the tutor song. So the percent of the tutor song in which you found that the juvenile was attentive. And on the y-axis, you have the similarity of that pupil song to the tutor. So this is learning on the y-axis, attention on the x-axis. And there's a couple things that I want to highlight. So the first, I think, is pretty conspicuous, is that there's a positive relationship between how attentive the juvenile was to the tutor song and how well he learned that song. So the more attentive the juvenile was to the tutor song, the more similar his song was to the tutor song. So hopefully that's pretty evident. And what's a little bit more subtle, but it is statistically significant, is that socially tutored birds, I should mention this earlier, socially tutored birds, the data for socially tutored pupils are these black circles, and for passively tutored pupils are these white squares. And it turns out that socially tutored birds are significantly more attentive to the songs of the tutor than passively tutored birds. And so given this relationship between attention and learning and the difference in these groups in attention to the tutor song, we thought that social interactions could promote or recruit these brain circuits for attention, and that recruitment of these brain circuits for attention could promote song learning. And indeed, when we looked at some of the brain areas that mediate attention in songbirds, we do find that a number of these areas are significantly more active when birds are socially tutored compared to birds that are passively tutored. Okay, so that's one set of experiments thinking about the role of social interactions, so the role of these external factors in modulating the degree of learning in these songbirds. Now, another set of experiments in our lab try to highlight these intrinsic factors that can modulate learning. So things like biological predispositions. So there has been a number of studies looking at biological predispositions, and indeed we do find that in songbirds, various songbird species, there are predispositions that can shape and sculpt the trajectory of learning. So for example, if you house birds in mixed species environments, birds will selectively learn the songs of their own species and not the songs of other species. So they have this, these species this makes sense, right? So the species are predisposed to learn their own songs over the songs of other species, despite the availability of both species songs. Now, people have invoked sort of biological predispositions in learning for humans as well, in terms of thinking about speech and language structures. And one of the reasons for that is, so if you do the sort of survey of languages around the world, the first thing that shows up that you see is that there's a huge diversity of sounds that people use, a huge diversity of speech and language structures around the world. But if you look closely, there are actually quite a few patterns that are more common than you'd expect by chance. And we call these patterns that are more expected by chance universals. And there are quite a few universal patterns across languages. So things like stress patterning, things like word order, or some other measures of prosody. There are a number of commonalities across these languages. And scientists have hypothesized that these universals actually could be rooted in biological predispositions in vocal learning in humans. Now, fortunately, you get something similar happening in species like the zebra finch. Now, Richard Zahn was a behavioral biologist who's one of this sort of eminent behavioral biologist who studied zebra finches in the wild. He wrote this book called sort of the Bible of the zebra finch world, called The Zebra Finch. And what he did in study in the sort of early 90s, he went around, so these birds are endemic to Australia, and he went around Australia and recorded the songs of zebra finches in different locations. And he found that different populations of zebra finches produced different songs, and that's not surprising. But he also found that there are a number of patterns that were shared across populations. So for example, he found a number of common syllables or acoustic units across these various populations. And he found that some of these syllables were placed in particular parts of the song. So for example, if a bird produced a distance call in its song, that distance call tended to be located at the end of the phrase or the motif. And if the bird produced this, what's called a high syllable, this high syllable, if there was a high syllable in the bird song, that syllable will be somewhere in the middle of the motif. And the motif, again, is the phrase that they sing. So you found this common pattern. And if you look at sort of a normal song that a bird produced, they often concatenate these motifs together to form what's called a song bout. So this is a bird singing two motifs back to back. And what we're going to do is highlight the syllables here. So you have the distance call at the end of each motif, and then you have the high-pitched syllable at somewhere in the middle of the motif. So this sort of ordering or placing of these syllables at different parts different parts of the motif seems to be a universal acoustic pattern in these zebra finches. And we wondered to what degree this universal patterning might be a manifestation of biological predispositions in learning. And so to do this, a graduate student, Logan James, and I ran this experiment, which I really, really like. And so what we did was we took these 5 commonly produced zebra finch syllables, including these 2 here. This is like the distance call and the high-pitched syllable from the previous study. So we took these 5 common syllables, and what we did is we created randomized sequences of syllables. So we take these 5 syllables, put them in one order, and then randomize that order in the next iteration, and randomize the order again in the next iteration. So it would look something like this, where here are 4 sequences in which the order of syllables varies across sequences. So maybe if you just look at one of these syllables, so let's just take the D syllable here. It's this red syllable. In the first sequence, it's the 3rd syllable. In the first sequence, it's the 3rd syllable of the motif. In the second sequence, it's the 2nd syllable. In the 3rd sequence, it's the 1st syllable. And in the 4th sequence, it's the 4th syllable. And basically, we created this whole sort of population or pool of sequences of these 5 syllables. And we presented these randomized sequences to these birds. And we actually tutored these birds with these randomized sequences. And we basically asked, if you're tutored with these randomized sequences, what sequence do you end up producing? And is there a common sequence that all these birds produce if they're tutored with these randomized sequences? And just to make sure we're clear, so we're telling them, you can think of it this way, we're telling them what sounds to produce, right? A, B, C, D, and E, but we're not telling them which order to produce them in. We're kind of giving them the whole buffet of different sequences, say, which one do you want to produce? It turns out that when you do this, they actually produce a single sequence. They often converge on a similar sequence, and they converge on a sequence that matches the sort of universal pattern found in wild populations. So for example, here, what we did is we looked at the position of these with these different syllables. So this D syllable, which is the distance call, and this E syllable is a high pitch syllable. And we looked at the position. And if the bird produced the D syllable, it almost always put it at the end of the motif. If it produced an E syllable, it's almost always put the E in the middle of the motif, and very, very, very rarely put it at the end of the motif. And if the bird produces other B syllable, it's what's called a noise syllable. If that's in a song, it puts that syllable at the beginning of the motif. And if you look at one of these, if you look at this pattern, this B in the beginning, E in the middle, D at the end, a lot of birds produce something like this: B-E-A-D, B-E-A-D, so bead, bead, bead. And so this is a pretty common sequence for these birds. Despite being tutored again with these randomized sequences, they seem to converge onto something that we actually see in these wild populations of birds, with a distance call at the end of the motif and the high-pitched syllable somewhere in the middle. Now, what's also interesting about these birds that were tutored with these randomized sequences is that they actually started producing these acoustic patterns that are commonly found in speech and music. So there are a number of common patterns. These are kind of like universals, so here's three of them. There's something called utterance final elongation, where you have, if you have a syllable that's placed at the end of the motif, it's longer in duration than if that same syllable was positioned somewhere else in the phrase, or somewhere in the middle of the phrase, for example. So there's utterance final elongation, where things at the end are longer, basically. You have this harmonic arch in music, where you have this phrase or a motif in music where, and then in that phrase, the beginning and end syllables are lower in, beginning and end notes are lower in pitch than the notes in the middle. And you get this sort of common, this is a common pattern that you see in musical phrases, and that's called a harmonic arch. As well, and then in speech and music, you do often see this alternation of stressed and unstressed syllables. It turns out we see all of these patterns in the songs of birds that are tutored with these randomized sequences. So you have, if you look at duration across these three positions, the beginning, the middle, or the end of the motif, the syllables at the end of the motif are longer than the syllables at other positions in the motif. If you look at mean frequency, the syllables in the middle of the motif are higher in mean frequency than the syllables at the beginning or the end. So this is the harmonic arch. And if you look at mean frequency, which is a type of pattern that's a stress that's patterned in speech and in music, you see that there's an alternation of mean frequency across adjacent syllables. So it seems like songbirds like the zebra finch, it seems like they're predisposed to produce these acoustic patterns that are commonly produced by humans. Again, despite being evolutionarily really, really distant from humans, for some reason, they also produce these patterns that are prevalent in humans. Okay, we're also curious about other types of universals in language or speech or music. And a recent paper just came out last year. We studied this linguistic law called Menzel's law. And according to this law, it states that the longer a linguistic construct is, the shorter are its constituents. So for example, if you think about syllables and words, the more syllables there are in the word, the shorter each of those syllables tend to be. And maybe this might help if you think about this. So I'm going to say three words. Each of them contain the word sleep in it. Okay. So the first word is sleep, sleepy, sleepiness. And I want you to think about the duration of the word sleep in each of those three words. So sleep, sleepy, sleepiness. And if you do this enough, you can do this with quite a few different words. But if you do this enough, I hope you can sense that when I say sleep by itself, sleep, the duration of that word, the sound sleep, is much longer when it's a monosyllabic word versus when it's embedded within a trisyllabic word like sleepiness. Anyways, that's sort of Menzel's law. And it turns out that when we studied 15 species of songbirds, we found most of the birds followed this pattern. So here's the songs of 2 different house finches. So here's one finch that sings a motif that has 7 elements. So in this case, the motif is the linguistic construct, and the number of syllables are each of the syllables are the constituents. So this motif has about 7, this construct has about 7 constituents, and this construct has, I don't know, about 15 or so or more. And what you can see is that the construct with more constituents has shorter constituents in them. So that's consistent with Menzel's law. And you can also look at within a bird. So if a bird sings, this is common, these songs of a common chaffinch, they have these repeats within their songs. And one construct is here, and this one has about 12 to 15 constituents in them. And another construct here with only 4 constituents. You can see this construct with more constituents consists of shorter constituents. So all these syllables are shorter in duration than these syllables here. So again, these birds seem to follow these principles that are commonly used to describe human language or speech structures. And we think we've been studying how these biological biases could shape the emergence and persistence of these universals in birds. And we think that, these biological biases probably exist in humans as well. All right, so that concludes the sort of handful of studies that I want to discuss about modulators and mechanisms of vocal learning. I'm just going to pivot for the last part of the talk to think about modulators and mechanisms of vocal performance. So turns out that when we change a lot of the ways that we speak depending on who we're talking to. So for example, we change the rate, the speed at which we speak, the words that we use, the pitch, the intonation of our voice, all sorts of things. We change all those depending on whether or not we're talking to young children. For example, this is my picture of my kids when they're younger, or if we'll change it if we're speaking to a room full of adults or university students. And so we sort of modulate how we speak depending on the age of the audience, as well as how much the audience knows about particular topics and about jargon that we might use. All right, so there's a context-dependent modulation of vocal communication for human speech. And I've been studying this for quite a while now, and I started these studies when I was a postdoc at the University of California, San Francisco. But let me just walk you through some of the procedures or just the descriptions of this. So I study these in a couple species of songbirds, Bengalese finches here and zebra finches. And what both these birds do is these male Bengalese finches and zebra finches, they often direct their songs towards an audience, and those are called directed songs, or they can just not sing toward anyone at all. They can just be singing, to anyone, to no one. So these are undirected songs. Now, females are the audience for their courtship songs, and these birds use their songs for courtship interactions. And when they see a female, they get really excited and they sing this courtship song. They direct this courtship song at the female. These are called female-directed songs. And we've been studying the differences between undirected and female-directed songs across these species for many, many years. I'm just going to give you a couple examples to give you a flavor for what we study. So this is a study looking at context-dependent variation in the songs of Bengalese finches. And one of the first things we'll look at is tempo. And what we do to measure tempo is to look at the duration of a stereotype sequence of syllables. So here we're looking at the duration of the sequence A, B, C, D, E, D, E. And that's we're just looking from the onset of the A to the onset of the E. And if you look at the duration of this sequence when the bird is singing undirected songs, so in this case, the bird is by itself and just sort of singing a song. And so this sequence is about 690 milliseconds. But when you put a female in there and have him sing courtship song to the female, that song, the sequence duration becomes shorter. So it goes to now 680 milliseconds. It's about 1 to 2% decrease in sequence duration. And this is basically it represents a speeding up of song. His song is now faster. And it's not surprising, right? So when you put a female in there, the birds get really aroused. They kind of puff up and they start doing their courtship dance. And so they have this female directed song seems to be a highly aroused song. And so it's not surprising that it's faster. And so this, it's not a huge difference in tempo, but females can tell. These birds have really, they can hear really well, and they can discriminate even small millisecond changes in the timing. And so females can tell that these songs are faster. So that's, so they change their tempo, basically. Female directed songs are faster than undirected songs. But you can also look at the syllable structure. And what we're doing here is we're measuring the fundamental frequency of syllables with flat harmonic structure. So here is the fundamental for this syllable is here, and these are the harmonics of that fundamental. And we're going to measure the fundamental frequency of we're calling this one the B syllable. We're going to measure the fundamental frequency of the B syllable every time he produces the B syllable. And we're going to plot a histogram of the fundamental frequencies. And so this is what it looks like when this bird is singing undirected song. Okay. And so this is the central tendency here. I don't know where it is, maybe 2050 or something like that. So that's the central tendency. And sometimes he's flat, sometimes he's sharp. You can see this sort of relatively wide distribution of fundamental frequencies. And that's this when he's singing undirected song. But when he's singing to a female, he tightens that up. He hits that target pitch or the fundamental frequency much more consistently and much more accurately. And so you see a narrower range of distributions here. And you can measure these distributions or the variability using what's called a coefficient of variation. So it's basically the standard deviation divided by the mean, but it's a metric of how variable the fundamental frequencies are in these different conditions. You can see that the CV is higher when the bird is singing undirected song compared to the female directed song, or phrased differently, the variability is lower when he's singing female directed song compared to when he's singing undirected song. So those are two consistent things that we see in two consistent differences between undirected songs and female directed songs. And we find consistent changes in Bengalese finches and zebra finches. And we find that these changes to song are conspicuous, and actually females prefer the songs that have these changes. So they prefer songs that are more stereotyped, or they prefer songs that are less variable in fundamental frequency and that are faster. We also know that this modulation from undirected song to female directed song does not require social learning. So these birds don't have to see their fathers doing that in order to do that themselves as adults. And we also know that social context in which the song is produced has really dramatic effects on brain activity and gene expression in the brain. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is when I first introduced this topic, I sort of juxtapose how we speak when we're talking to little kids versus to adults. And this is the last thing I want to talk about here. So when people direct their speech towards infants, it's called infant-directed speech. And generally that speech is slower and it's higher in pitch. It actually has more variable pitch. You have this sort of waxing and waning of pitch. But there's definitely a change in tempo, slowing down of tempo, and a change in pitch. And we also see that infants actually pay more attention to infant-directed speech than to adult-directed speech. So we wondered, maybe birds might change the way they sing when they're directing songs to juveniles versus directing songs to other adults. And maybe this juvenile directed song might actually enhance attention to the song. So in the sort of study that I talked to you earlier about in terms of looking at social influences on vocal learning, we also looked at how these tutors might modulate their song performance depending on who they're singing to. And so this is just a description of Zebra Finch song. A couple of things I didn't tell you about. There's these introductory notes that they repeat before their motifs. And again, they concatenate multiple motifs together within a song bout. And so in addition to measuring things within the motif, we also measure like the intervals between motifs. Now, these tutors, we asked, how these tutors might change their songs when they sing to a female, and consistent with previous studies, we find a decrease in the CV of the fundamental frequency. This means there's a decrease in the variability of the fundamental frequency, basically what I said in the previous slide. So that the CV of the fundamental frequency goes down. Oh, I should mention that what I'm plotting here is the percent change in these various features of directed song compared to undirected song. So how different the directed song is compared to the undirected song, depending on who the audience is. In this case, it's an adult female. Okay, so when they're singing to an adult female, the CV of fundamental frequency goes down. The repetition of the introductory notes actually increases, and that's consistent with previous findings. But we actually see no change in this interval between the motif. Now, in contrast, when you look to see how these tutors modulated their song when they're directing their songs towards pupils, these juveniles, they did not, when they directed songs at pupils, they did not change the variability of the fundamental frequency. They did change the introductory notes. They did increase the introductory notes, but what they also did was they increased the interval between motifs. So there's a significant increase in the interval between these motifs that suggests they're spacing out the elements a little bit more, or the motifs more. So there are these differences that, depending on who these tutors were singing to, they changed their songs in different ways. And interestingly, when we looked at the pupils' behavior, and whether or not they heard the tutor was singing a directed song, an undirected song, or a pupil-directed song, we found that the pupils would pay more attention to the pupil-directed song than to these undirected songs. So this sort of the behavior of the pupil and the behavior of the tutor bear some resemblance to how adults and infants change their behavior when they're interacting with each other. Okay, so those are the experiments that there's many more experiments to talk about, but just for the sake of time, I'm gonna cut it there. But I do want to mention, in addition to thinking of these behavioral experiments, one of the things that we think are really important about songbirds is not just for to study these behaviors, but we think they have these translational applications. And because song learning and control are mediated by brain circuits that in songbirds that resemble brain areas in humans, and we know this resemblance based on gene expression studies, thinking about neurochemicals in different brain areas, neural activities, et cetera, et cetera. Because of these parallels between bird brains and human brains, we think that understanding how the songbird brain regulates vocal learning and performance can provide insight into the brain mechanisms that regulate human communication. All right, and the last thing I want to do, because this is part of the McGill bicentennial, it's a way to think about McGill's history in academia. And I want to say that I'm part of a long McGill tradition. And there's a rich community of biologists and neuroscientists at McGill that study mechanisms of behavior. And there's a large community of past and present that have studied birds in some way, shape, or form. But I wanted to just sort of highlight one researcher in the biology department who preceded my time at McGill, and that is Professor Robert Lemon. So Bob Lemon was a professor in biology at McGill from 1965 to 1999. And this is an excerpt from his obituary. He passed in 2012. It says, his papers on Markov chain models of song sequences were influential outside of ornithology and helped researchers think about rules that govern the organization of behavior. Now, the really interesting thing about Bob's work, and especially about these Markov chain models, is that's exactly a lot of my work has been looking at the sort of chaining of these acoustic elements within a bird song. And so I use Markov models to look at the sequencing of songs, syllables within Bengalese finch song, and I asked how those sequences, Markov models, are learned from tutor to pupil. And I also ask how these Markov models, or these patterns of sequences, might vary as a function of social environments or social contexts. So I guess I just want to emphasize that I'm part of a long McGill tradition. I hope to continue to make contributions to this field and to continue to uncover these general principles underlying the organization of behavior. All right, now I wouldn't be where I am without a wonderful lab and wonderful collaborators. And so I want to thank first and foremost Professor Sarah Woolley. She's sort of a lifetime collaborator, if you will. but we talk about experiments all the time. And so she's a professor in biology, and so she's also part of this McGill tradition. And I wouldn't be where I am without her. I also want to thank, I've been blessed with excellent graduate students in the past, and I'm listing them here. I want to highlight the work by Nancy, Laura, and Logan. Logan did the work on the universal, like the tutoring with randomized sequences, and Laura and Nancy did the work with thinking about social influences on vocal learning in Zebra Finches. And in addition to these graduate students, I also want to thank the many undergraduate students who have been to the lab to have helped with various projects in many ways. And I also want to thank funding sources for being supportive for my work, things like the CFI, the FRQNT, and INSERC. Also these local research centers like the CSBN and Concordia, and the CRBLM, which is the Center for Research on Brain, Language, and Music, it's sort of situated primarily in McGill. It's a great consortium of researchers studying speech and language in humans, and amongst those researchers studying humans, there are a few of us that study birds, and that we try to link our birds with their humans studies as much as possible. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions. I'll stop sharing.
That was a wonderful presentation, Professor Sakata. Thank you. There are a couple questions that I'd love to ask. The first is, at what stage of development does song acquisition stop in birds? So when does a bird song kind of become finite and doesn't change anymore?
Can I start sharing my screen again? It's actually like the next slide. If I click, boop, I can tell you a little bit about that. I didn't go over this just because it didn't fit in as well, but basically there are these critical periods in young bird's development that in which these birds engage in auditory learning or sensory motor learning. And so I'm just going to quickly go through this. Starting about 20 days post-hatching. So this is a timeline from hatching here on the left, and this is the number of days since hatching. And starting about 20 days post-hatching, they enter what's called the sensory period. And that's a sort of critical period for intense auditory learning. And that's when the period where they learn what songs they need to produce or they want to produce. And then after they memorize that song, the sounds that they need to produce, they start babbling and practicing their vocalization. So learning the motor commands to reproduce those sounds. And that's the sensory motor phase here. It's a period of intense vocal practice and refinement. And by the time they're about 90 to 120 days old, that's when they become sexually mature, and that's when their songs crystallize. And in this species, that's when they actually stop learning. So they actually, at the end of these critical periods, their song, so in adulthood, they crystallize on a song, and that's the song that they sing for the rest of their life.
Amazing, thank you. Another question is the similarity between human and songbird vocalization learning a characteristic that has kind of evolved independently twice, or do you think it's maybe ancestral and has been lost in other texts, or is this something that maybe we don't really know as much about?
I think it's, given how distantly related they are, it probably evolved independently in songbirds and in humans and primates and so forth. As to where it evolved in the clade of birds, it's unclear. We do see some of these patterns, these sort of universal patterns in non-songbirds as well. So there's like this utterance final elongation we see in other species that are not songbirds. So I suspect it might be rooted in a more ancestral species, something that's ancestral to a bunch of different bird clades. And I do think it's probably something to do with the, coordinating the vocal musculature with the respiratory system. And so maybe when people have thought about motor contributions to these universal patterns, with regard to utterance final elongation, they think basically, when you're speaking at the end, you're kind of trailing off, and your voice kind of just slowly trails off. And then when it trails off, it prolongs that last vocalization. So we think that happens in humans. I think that happens in birds, and that's what might be underlying this utterance final elongation. But the short answer is that I think that they're evolved independently.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Another question was, someone was just wondering if you know of any good spots on Montreal or just in Montreal to find and listen to birds. If there's any particular locations that you enjoy.
I mean, so I have to admit, I'm not much of a birder. I like birding, but I'm not an ornithologist. And I like bird behavior, I like bird songs. I don't go out as often to listen to birds. I go out when I can, and if I'm around the mountain or if I'm outside of the city, I'll listen to birds. But I don't have a particularly favorite birding spot, unfortunately. So I can't give a lot of insight into that one.
No, that is no problem at all. I have one final question if we have time for it. Someone was wondering if birds have different biological predispositions to certain sound motifs. What are some limitations of song acquisition of birds that migrate to a new location in early developmental stages? So are there kind of specific sounds that they might not, birds of different species can't learn?
There are, so a couple answers to that. So there are constraints into what birds can learn. So for example, some sounds are very difficult for example, a zebra finch cannot produce the range of sounds that like a mockingbird can. And there are these species differences in vocal musculature that predispose them to produce their own species song, and same with brain patterns of brain activity as well. So there are constraints on vocal learning and they're not only biases, but also constraints on learning. And so there are, I guess that's one answer, there are constraints. With regard to sort of overwintering, sort of mixed flocks, I mean, I think depending on what species you study, a lot of times when they're in the like overwintering somewhere, their brains aren't really doing much in the way of learning, and they're not actually doing a lot of singing over the winter as well. And so we don't see a lot of learning going on during those periods, but there are other periods, either like late in the summer or early in the spring, when birds come back for breeding, you do see a little bit more plasticity happening there. So when there are these mixed flocks, there tends to be less plasticity, so there's not going to be a lot of learning of heterospecific songs.
Wonderful, thank you.
Right, well, thank you. Thanks again to Professor Sakata for an absolutely fascinating presentation. I have learned so much. I've got a head full of questions. Thank you. Could have gone on for ages. On behalf of, I wonder whether, Annie, would you like to turn your camera on as well, if you're there? Great. So Professor Sakata, on the behalf of the Cutting Edge series, I would like to present you with a couple of tokens of appreciation. And the first one is, oh my goodness, you can see it's Tea and Fossils, which is a brief history of the Redpath Museum.
Very much.
The next one, let me see, okay, is the Fossils Tale. It's a guide to the Redpath Museum's Dawson Gallery exhibits, including its history. And Ingrid tells me that this is the gift which is the most popular, is a book token. And this book token has an extract of a letter from Charles Darwin.
Oh, excellent.
For his finches. That's so appropriate, isn't it? Yeah. So thank you once again. That's great. I'll put those into internal mail.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you also to our student ambassadors, Annie and Samantha and Caitlin. You did an excellent job on the facilitation and asked some really great questions. Thank you. So this is the last of the Bicentennial Cutting Edge series. And I'd like to take a moment just to thank the people in the background who've worked so hard. Stuart, Jonathan, who's on today, and the rest of the audiovisual team for their always professional work. To all the student ambassadors, you've done a great job. To everybody who spoke, who gave their time, which was really appreciated. The Cutting Edge Organizing Committee for helping to come up with the speakers and to bring it all together. And for you, the audience, in participating in this series. But most of all, I would like to thank Ingrid Burker for organizing and putting this Cutting Edge series on over all these years and bringing us all together and bringing her wonderful, unique energy and enthusiasm to every single session that we've had. So with that, I would say goodbye to all of you for until fall 2022, when the Faculty of Science Cutting Edge lecture series will start again. And maybe that time we'll be able to get back to having it in person. I hope so. Stay tuned to all the Faculty of Science website for the updates on what's happening. And meanwhile, I'll take the opportunity to wish you all a very healthy and joyful spring and summer, listening to birds, perhaps. Thank you. Bye-bye.